My name is Lauren Whitmore. I was 39 years old, and the thing that haunted me most about Thanksgiving night last year was not my sister slapping me in front of nearly 30 relatives, nor the cutting cold on the porch when I was thrown out while everyone else was still sitting at the dinner table. The thing that haunted me most was the sound of the lock clicking behind me. Just a few seconds earlier, the whole room had still been full of silverware tapping against plates, laughter, conversation, and the television murmuring from the living room. Then my sister shot to her feet, turned toward me, and slapped me so hard my head snapped to one side. The whole house went silent. I had not even touched my cheek yet when my mother looked straight at me and said, very slowly, very coldly, "You apologize to your sister right now, or walk out of my house and don't come back." My father did not say a word. He simply stood up, walked to the front door, pulled it open wide, and stood there holding it, as if I were some stranger who had overstayed her welcome. And that was how I walked out. Without crying, without arguing, without looking back. By the next morning, my family still thought they had just thrown out the weakest person in the house. What they did not know was that the person they pushed away that night was the only one who had been quietly keeping their whole world from falling apart for years. This is the story of the Thanksgiving night my family threw me out, and how only days later, everything they thought was secure began to collapse. I drove back to Pennsylvania on Wednesday afternoon under a dull gray sky, with low clouds hanging so close they looked like they could touch the road. The drive from Cleveland back to that small town was painfully familiar to me. I had made it too many times over the last 15 years, enough to know every turn, every old gas station, every roadside coffee shop that stayed open late. Some years the snow came down so heavily I gripped the steering wheel until my hands went numb. Other years cold rain blurred the windshield for hours. But every year I still went. Almost nobody ever asked why. They were simply used to the fact that I would show up. My trunk was packed full. 2 trays of hot food I had ordered from a restaurant near my office. A case of wine, pumpkin pie, apple pie, cream-colored napkins, cinnamon-scented candles, and a new tablecloth, because my mother had once complained that the old one looked worn out. I bought all of it, the way people carry out an old habit, without even thinking about the cost anymore. I always told myself that some families are not good at saying, "I love you." They only know how to lean on each other in clumsier ways. I believed that for so long it became a kind of private faith inside me. Grandma Rose was the one who planted that faith in me, though she never once taught me to sacrifice myself to the point of disappearing. She only taught me that when you love somebody, you do not let them fall if you are still able to hold them up. I still remember her hand in those final days in bed, thin and cold, but still squeezing mine so tightly. She looked at me for so long I was afraid to blink. Then she said very softly, "When this family starts falling apart, they'll lean on whoever loves them most." I carried those words with me for years. When the roof over my parents' house was torn up after an ice storm, I was the first one to wire money. When my mother had to go through a long round of medical testing that insurance would not fully cover, I quietly called the hospital and paid the rest. When my father retired and was still buried under tool debt stacked all over the garage, I helped clear it out without making him lose face. When Sophie said she only needed a little help to open her own beauty studio, I believed it would help my sister stand on her own feet. So I poured money into it, as if I were betting on a future where the whole family could finally breathe easier. The kitchen was remodeled. The heating system was replaced. The old walls were painted in lighter colors. I knew exactly how every single thing in that house had been saved. I never wanted thanks. I only wanted the truth to exist somewhere in that house. But there was a deeper ache than that, one so quiet it took me years to finally call it by its real name. Not once, in front of other people, had anyone in my family ever said one simple sentence: that the house was still standing because of me. Not because of the money, but because there was always one person who showed up exactly when everything was about to collapse. In their eyes, Sophie was the daughter who stayed close, the one who was physically there, the one who showed up. I was the one who lived far away, the one who was always busy, the one who only sent money, gifts, and paid bills. Maybe distance made them forget that showing up does not always look the same. I pulled into my parents' driveway a little before 4 in the afternoon. The sky had already turned that dark gray color of late fall, the kind of in-between light that makes everything feel familiar and cold at the same time. I sat in the car for a few seconds longer, both hands still resting on the wheel, looking through the windshield at the house I had spent too many years visiting, more out of silent obligation than because it ever truly felt like home. From the outside, it looked warm. Yellow light spilled from the windows across the front yard. The fall wreath was still hanging on the door, as if there really were a proper family gathering happening inside. I told myself not to overthink it. It was just another holiday. Just another year of driving back, carrying things inside, smiling just enough, staying just long enough, and then leaving again. I opened the trunk and struggled a little as I lifted each bag out. The food trays were still warm. The wine bottles clinked softly together. One of the pie boxes tipped to the side and I caught it again with my elbow. That was when the side door swung open, and the person standing in the doorway was not my mother smiling the way mothers do in holiday cards. Her voice came before I even reached the steps. "Lauren, don't tilt the casserole. Put everything on the kitchen counter." No hug. No. Was the drive tiring? Just instructions. The same voice, the same way. As if I had not just driven 3 hours to get there. As if I had only stepped in from the backyard carrying groceries. "Hi, Mom," I said, so softly even I could feel the words disappear into the air. Come in. Sophie's been in the kitchen since noon." I stepped inside and saw that my sister really was there, standing in the middle of the kitchen as if it were her own stage. Sophie was adjusting the table runner, tilting her head as she looked over a cheese tray, still holding a sprig of rosemary, the way people do in those online entertaining videos. She turned toward me and gave me a smile so thin it almost did not count as one. "Finally made it." "Right on time," I said, setting down the pie box. Sophie shrugged. "For you, maybe." I did not answer. I bent down to take more things out of the bags, and that was when my eyes landed on an envelope lying crooked beside the coffee maker. There was a bank logo in the upper left corner. It had already been opened, and the edge was bent out of shape. It sat there in a strange way. Not exactly hidden, but not something people leave out in the middle of the kitchen, unless there is something they do not want noticed. Beside it, near the stack of napkins, was a pile of printed papers shoved halfway under Grandma Rose's old recipe notebook. I recognized it instantly, because the brown leather cover was worn at one corner, and she had written her name on the first page in blue ink. I had only glanced at it, truly only one quick glance, but Sophie moved immediately. She placed her hand on the notebook and pushed the papers farther underneath it, with a reflex that was too fast to be called casual. "Don't touch things that aren't yours," she said quietly, her voice low but sharp as a thin blade. I looked up at her. For a second I thought maybe I had heard wrong. Not because the words were too harsh, but because they were harsh in such a strange way. I was standing in the kitchen I had practically paid to renovate, under the lighting I had put a deposit down on for the electrician, beside the new stone countertops whose invoices I knew by heart, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had just been warned for looking too long at a place where I had no right to be. "I was just looking for somewhere to put the wine," I said. Sophie smiled, but her eyes did not. "Then just put down the wine." I turned and opened the box of glasses, slowly, almost deliberately. While I was doing that, I heard footsteps coming down the hallway into the kitchen. Caleb stood in the doorway with one hand in his jacket pocket and a can of unopened soda in the other. He saw me, and his expression caught for just a second, like someone remembering what he had meant to say and changing his mind at the last minute. He looked like someone who knew more than he wanted to say. "Hey, Lauren," he said. "Hey, Caleb." He nodded, looked over at Sophie, then back down at the soda can in his hand. For some reason, I had the odd feeling he was waiting for a moment that only he knew was coming. But then Sophie turned to him and said flatly, "Why are you standing there? Go get more ice." Caleb muttered a small, "Okay," and left. I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, one hand resting on the edge of the counter, my eyes moving over the freshly painted walls, the new cabinet handles, the bright stone surface, and the pendant light above the table. Everything so familiar to me, it almost lived in my head like an itemized list of payments. Everything in that room carried more of my fingerprints than anyone there would ever admit. And yet somehow, the kitchen suddenly did not feel like a kitchen preparing for a holiday anymore. It felt like a place hiding something, and everyone in it seemed to know more than I did. Less than an hour later, the house was full. The front door kept opening and closing, shoes thudded across the rug by the porch, children shouted to each other in the hallway, someone laughed loudly from the living room, and football commentary echoed from the television, turned up a little too high. The smell of roasted turkey, butter, cinnamon, and coffee should have felt comforting. But standing in that kitchen, I felt like I was watching a play that had been staged too perfectly. So polished it became unsettling. My mother moved through the crowd, with a brightness on her face I almost never saw directed at me. She kept taking Sophie from one group to another the way someone presents the main character of the evening. "Sophie takes care of everything," she told Aunt Marlene, her hand resting lightly against my sister's back. "She's always here." A little later, I heard her telling the Petersons from next door, "Honestly, I don't know what we'd do without her. She's been holding us together." I was standing right there, a tray of glasses still in my hands, and it took me a few seconds to fully absorb what I had just heard. Not because I was shocked anymore. Maybe because some sentences, no matter how prepared you think you are to hear them, still hurt in their own very private way when they finally land. When my turn came to be mentioned, my mother only tilted her head toward me, as if she had just remembered there was another daughter in the house. "And Lauren works in the city," she said. "She's very busy. Works in the city." That was it. None of the people standing there knew I was a senior operations executive for a commercial construction company in Cleveland. None of them knew I managed projects worth tens of millions of dollars, handled meetings where one wrong decision could trigger a chain of major losses. But inside my own family, I was always reduced to a softer, blurrier version of myself. Some daughter who did something in the city, came by once in a while, brought gifts, and then left again. I set the tray of glasses down on the dining table, trying to keep my hands steady. That was when I heard my mother's voice floating in from the living room, light and clear enough that I could not pretend I had missed it. "We finally used some family savings to redo the kitchen." Family savings? I went completely still between the dining room and the kitchen. The phrase moved through me slowly. Almost absurdly slowly. I knew very well there had been no such thing as family savings. No joint fund, no secret cushion, no financial miracle that had saved that house from damp winters and piling bills. There had only been transfers from my bank account, only the quiet way I had paid and kept going as if none of it had happened. And yet coming from my mother's mouth, it had suddenly become a prettier story, a cleaner story, and one with my name erased from it completely. When I turned, I caught Aunt Evelyn watching me from the armchair beside the window. She said nothing. She simply looked at me long enough for me to understand that she had heard it, understood it, and that at least one person in that house knew exactly what was happening. She gave the slightest shake of her head, almost impossible to notice if you were not looking closely. I took one slow breath, trying to hold down whatever was rising in my chest. A little later, when people started drifting apart, the men back to the living room around the television, the women gathering near the dining table, the children running down to the basement, I carried a stack of napkins into the hallway beside the laundry room. Sophie was standing there alone, looking down at her phone. The yellow kitchen light hit one side of her face, making the small smile at the corner of her mouth look even colder. I stopped a few steps away from her. "Why are you pretending this house paid for itself?" I asked, quietly enough that no one but us could hear. Sophie looked up. She did not look flustered. She did not look startled. She did not even take a second to pretend she had no idea what I meant. She simply looked at me with a calm that was almost cruel. "Because people prefer the daughter who stayed," she said evenly, "over the one who only sends money." I stared at her without speaking. Not because I was shocked, but because the sentence was too clean. Too exact. There was no room left to lie to myself and pretend Sophie had somehow accidentally taken what belonged to me, or that she truly believed the version of the story our mother was telling out there to everyone else. No. She knew perfectly well. She knew whose money had kept that house standing. She knew who had saved the winters, the bills, and the quiet emergencies, and she still chose to stand in the light and smile, while other people called her the one who had held everything together. Sophie slipped her phone into her coat pocket and tilted her head at me, as if we had just finished a completely ordinary conversation. "You should try smiling more tonight," she said. "People notice when you sulk." Then she walked past me, leaving behind that sweet, overpowering perfume in the narrow hallway for a few seconds, before it dissolved into the laughter and football noise from the living room. I stood there without moving, my hands still gripping the stack of napkins, listening to my own heartbeat thud slow and heavy. Sometimes the most painful thing is not having someone steal something from you. It is the moment you realize they did it a long time ago, very deliberately, and never felt guilty about it even once. Dinner moved forward inside the same familiar kind of noise I had once thought I had learned to endure. Silverware tapping plates, someone asking for more cranberry sauce, children being told to sit still, football still humming in the background from the living room like a soundtrack that never changed. I sat at one end of the table, close enough to hear every conversation, and far enough that nobody really paid attention to me. Sophie sat on the other side near my mother, laughing and talking with the ease of someone who felt as if the house, the dinner, the whole night was unfolding exactly the way she wanted. After everyone finished eating, the men drifted back to the sofa, the children spread out on the floor with markers, and the women carried dishes into the kitchen before coming back with coffee or wine in their hands. I stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching the yellow-lit living room, the familiar faces, the overlapping conversations blending into something soft and thick like an old blanket. Then Sophie sat down in the armchair near the floor lamp, lifted her hand to smooth her hair back, and at that exact moment, the stone on her finger caught the light. I saw it almost immediately. An old turquoise ring, the deep blue-green stone, the prongs slightly crooked on one side, and the tiny scratch along the band that I knew better than anyone. My heart felt like a fist closed around it. I did not need to step closer. I did not need to hold it. I knew it was Grandma Rose's ring. When I was 16, she had slipped that ring off her own finger, placed it in my palm, and smiled. "One day, this will be yours. Not because it's valuable, but because you'll understand the value of things that have traveled through an entire lifetime." My hand had been so small, then the ring nearly slipped down to my middle knuckle. I had carried those words inside me for so long, they no longer felt like a promise. They felt like a peaceful memory, a soft place in me whenever I thought of her. I stepped one pace farther into the living room, feeling oddly weightless in the way people do when they are too shocked to become angry right away. "Why is she wearing Grandma's ring?" I asked. The room did not go completely silent, but it quieted enough that the people nearest us all heard. Sophie looked at my mother first, very quickly, then lowered her gaze to the ring again, as if waiting for an answer that had already been prepared. My mother did not hesitate. "Your sister earned it," she said, in a tone so calm it made my blood run cold. "She was the one here." I stood there looking at her, then at the ring, then at my sister's face. Some sentences do not hurt right at the point where they strike you. They hurt because they cut all the way through something you once believed nobody could ever take. Money was one thing, a house was one thing, but that ring, that was my grandmother's hand placing something in mine when I was 16. That was a promise spoken in gentleness. And now, it was sitting on the hand of someone who did not understand where it had come from, only that it was something she could be given if she stood in the right place, close enough to the right people, at the right time. Nobody said another word. There was only the tiny sound of the stone tapping lightly against Sophie's wine glass as she lifted her hand. In the corner of the room, Caleb lowered his head as if he were reading something on his phone, but I could see the tension in his neck. He knew. Maybe he had known about this for a while. Under the small table beside the sofa, Aunt Evelyn's hand found mine and squeezed gently, just enough to tell me I was not losing my mind, that yes, what was happening in that room really was as cruel and absurd as it felt. I pulled my hand back before anyone could notice and turned toward the kitchen under the excuse of getting more water. The sink was full of dishes. The dishwasher stood half open. There were pie crumbs and half-used mugs still scattered across the counter. I leaned against the edge of the counter for a second and took a slow breath. My eyes dropped to Grandma Rose's old recipe notebook, still resting on top of that stack of printed papers. I do not know exactly what made me do it. Maybe the ring, maybe my mother's voice, maybe the fact that I needed to touch something that still felt real. But I stepped forward and opened the notebook. The first few pages held recipes for butter cookies, beef stew with dark beer, and cinnamon apple pie. Her familiar slanted handwriting stretched neatly across the yellowed paper. I turned one more page and found an old scrap of paper tucked between two recipes. I only had time to glance at it before footsteps started coming down the hall, so I slipped it into my coat pocket without unfolding it. I pulled a glass of water closer to me, but before I could take a sip, Sophie started talking again, as if she had decided no silence would be allowed to survive in that room tonight. She leaned back in her chair, slowly turning the ring on her finger, her voice light but loud enough for the nearest people to hear. "Lauren was always like this when we were kids," she said with a laugh, her eyes sliding over a few relatives before settling on me. Everything had to become an event. Too dramatic. A few people gave nervous little laughs. Not loud, not comfortable, just the kind people use when they do not know how else to react, but still want to keep the mood from falling apart. Sophie took a sip of wine and kept going, this time with a sweeter voice, as if she were telling a funny childhood story. She always needed everything to revolve around her, needed attention all the time, she shrugged. And if she didn't get it, she'd start playing the victim, play the martyr. I stayed quiet. Looking back, that might be the thing that angers me most about that night, not because I was weak, but because I tried to stay calm until the very end. I looked down at my hands, my fingers laced too tightly together. The scrap of paper was still in my pocket, the only small comfort left in that whole house. I told myself I only had to get through tonight. Just do not become the version of me they have always told people I am. But Sophie did not stop. It was as if she smelled my silence and took it as permission. "Some people always want to act like they're the one who sacrifices the most," she said, tilting her head with a smile. "It must be exhausting." I stood up before I could say something I would never be able to take back. I only wanted to walk through the living room, into the kitchen, pour myself more water, and breathe for a few seconds under the cold, white kitchen lights, instead of sitting there while my dignity was peeled away piece by piece in front of my whole family. The living room was more crowded than I had realized. Children sat on the floor, adults filled every space between the armchairs and the coffee table, and the television kept murmuring behind it all. I turned sideways to move through the narrow space between the sofa and the edge of the table. That was when my shoulder lightly brushed Sophie's. It was the smallest contact, the kind of accidental bump that happens at every crowded family gathering and means absolutely nothing. But not to Sophie. She spun around so fast I only had time to see her expression change before her hand came down across my face. The sound cracked through the room so sharply that everything else seemed to disappear behind it. My head jerked to one side. My left cheek started burning almost immediately. I tasted something faintly metallic in my mouth. The whole room froze. No one screamed. No one jumped up. Time itself felt like it had been held still at the worst possible moment. Very slowly I turned my head back and looked at Sophie. Her hand was still hanging in the air, her chest rising and falling, her eyes lit with something so furious and triumphant, it made my stomach go cold. I did not lift a hand to my face. I did not lunge at her. I did not shout. I only stood there, hearing my own heart pounding inside my chest like a heavy, slow knock. My mother was the first person to move. She came toward me quickly. And for one stupid, painful second, I thought she would see the red mark blooming on my face, ask if I was all right, do at least the smallest thing a mother should do when her daughter has just been hit. But she stopped in front of me and said, her voice hard and icy, "You always push her. Say you're sorry, Lauren, right now." I looked at her. She hit me. My mother did not blink. Then maybe ask yourself why. I do not remember who took in a sharp breath somewhere behind me. I only remember the room suddenly feeling too bright, too cramped, and every face around me wearing the strained discomfort of people who did not want to get pulled into the truth. My father stood up from his chair. He did not look at me, and he did not look at Sophie. He just walked to the front door, opened it, and stood to one side with one hand on the frame. Something inside me seemed to shatter into tiny pieces. I bent down, picked my coat up off the back of the chair, and slipped my arms into it with a strange calm I still do not understand to this day. Aunt Evelyn rose halfway to her feet, her chair scraping softly across the wood floor. "Harold," she started. My father only turned his head and looked at her once. No words, no raised voice, but enough to make her stop, her lips pressed tight, both hands clenched with helplessness. I walked toward the door. As I passed my father, I caught the familiar smell of his shaving soap, the smell that had once belonged to my childhood, to Sunday mornings much gentler than that night. He still did not look at me. I stepped out onto the porch, and the cold November wind hit my face right on the cheek that was still burning. Then the door closed behind me. The click of the lock was soft, but I heard it more clearly than any other sound that night. And in that moment, I understood that the lock had not only shut me out of the house. It had shut me out of the role they had built for me all those years. The daughter who always paid, always swallowed it, always forgave, and always stayed. I sat in the car for a few seconds after starting the engine, both hands on the wheel, staring out at the dark road ahead without really seeing it. My left cheek was still hot, but that pain was simple, almost merciful compared to the emptiness spreading through my chest. I backed slowly out of the driveway, almost as if some instinct inside me wanted to delay the ending of something that was already over. In the rearview mirror, the house still looked bright, warm, peaceful, just like every other year. From the outside, nobody would have guessed that inside it, a door had just been closed in a way that could never be reopened the same way again. I drove the whole way home with the radio off. There was only the sound of the tires rolling across the cold, damp road and the highway lights passing in long stretches. At times I thought I should cry. At times I thought I should at least call someone. But I just kept driving, like someone forcing her body to keep doing the only thing it still knew how to do, while her mind had gone numb. Every time I stopped at a red light or slowed for a curve, Caleb's face flashed through my mind. The way he had stood in the kitchen doorway, looking like he wanted to say something but could not. The way he had lowered his head when my mother talked about the ring. And that evasive look in his eyes. It was not the look of someone who was only uncomfortable because of family tension. It was the look of someone who knew there was something worse happening beneath it. By the time I reached my apartment complex, it was almost midnight. The parking lot was quiet. A few windows on the second floor were still lit, but nearly everything else had disappeared into the thin, cold silence of late autumn night. I turned off the engine, sat still for another moment, then opened the door and stepped out. Wind rushed through the lot and made me pull my coat tighter around myself. I was about to head straight into the building when I suddenly thought of Caleb again, of that unfinished feeling he had left in me. For some reason, I turned toward the row of mailboxes under the awning. The key was stiff in the lock. Inside were a few flyers, an electric bill, and a thick envelope from the county records office that had likely been sitting there since earlier that week. I stood beneath the weak yellow hallway light and tore the envelope open with my fingertips. The papers inside slid out, stiff and cold. The first line that hit my eyes was "certified copy of deed transfer." I skimmed it once, then read it again more slowly, word by word, as if careful enough reading might somehow make the contents change. But they did not. My name, Lauren Whitmore, had been removed from the section listing ownership interests in the house. Sophie's name had been added in my place. At the bottom were 4 signatures: Harold Whitmore, Diane Whitmore, Sophie Whitmore, and Lauren Whitmore. I stared at the signature bearing my name until my vision started to blur. It was not mine. I knew that from the first L. The curve was too round, the trailing line at the end dragged too slowly. I signed my name almost every day at work, on contracts, documents, permits, bank papers. A signature is something the body remembers even more clearly than the mind. And the one sitting in front of me was a clumsy imitation, written by someone who thought getting the letters right was enough. I turned to the next page, and the cold inside me shifted instantly into something sharper, more dangerous. There was a record confirming that a new home equity line of credit had been opened not long after the deed transfer was recorded, meaning that after my name had been erased from the house, the value I had poured into it over the years did not disappear. It had been turned into cash, real cash, the kind somebody could draw from, spend, mortgage the future with, and then leave someone else to clean up the wreckage. I do not remember how I made it upstairs to my apartment. I only remember setting the stack of papers down on the kitchen table, switching on the light, and calling Daniel Cross. Daniel was a real estate attorney I had worked with on several major deals in Cleveland. It was far too late to call someone, but he still picked up on the third ring, sounding more awake than I expected. Daniel, I think my signature was forged on a deed transfer for my parents' house. He was silent for exactly 2 seconds. I heard paper rustling on the other end, as if he had just sat up straighter. Do you have a copy in your hands? I do. And they opened a new home equity line of credit right after it. The pause on his side of the line was longer that time. When he spoke again, there was nothing soft or polite left in his voice. Do not call them. Do not sign anything. And do not assume this was just your sister. I stood in my brightly lit kitchen, with the phone pressed to my ear, still staring at the forged version of my name at the bottom of the page. Daniel's last sentence was not loud, not dramatic, but it moved through me like ice water. Because up until that moment, after being slapped, thrown out, and stripped of my grandmother's ring, some part of me still wanted to believe all of this had been Sophie going too far. But now, looking at those 4 signatures lined up on the same legal document, I understood there are betrayals too large to be built by one person alone. Monday morning in Cleveland was cold and clear in an almost cruel way. Thin sunlight stretched across the glass buildings downtown, making everything look too clean, too normal, for what it felt like inside me. I arrived at Daniel's office almost 15 minutes early, and sat in the car watching people walk into work, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. There are mornings when the world keeps moving as if nothing has broken. And that is exactly what makes you feel as if you have been pushed outside your own life. Daniel greeted me with the same calm expression he always had, but the moment he set the file on the table, I knew I would not leave that room with any illusions still intact. He had pulled the entire record from the county, reviewed the chain of filings, and checked the basic money trail tied to the house. No circling around it. No gentle comfort people try to offer when the truth is too sharp. Your signature was forged, he said, sliding an enlarged copy toward me. There's no real doubt about that. I looked at it without saying anything. On the page, my name sat there at the bottom like betrayal written in neat black ink. Daniel turned to the next set of pages. The transfer was recorded a few weeks ago. Then a line of credit against the house's equity was opened almost immediately afterward. He placed more statements in front of me. I looked at the numbers, the arrows, the destinations of the money, and felt my throat tighten. Some of it went into Sophie's business account, Daniel said. Some of it paid off personal credit card debt. And some of it was used to cover your parents' overdue property taxes. I looked up at him. Maybe in that moment, I still needed to hear another person say what I had not yet found the strength to fully conclude myself. So it wasn't just Sophie, I said quietly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands folded together. No, it wasn't just her. Whoever started it, the benefit of this moved through that entire house. He paused a beat, then said it plainly, each word crisp. This is forgery. This is fraud. And if your parents signed those papers without ever calling you to confirm, they do not get to pretend they were completely innocent. I sat still for a long time. Outside the glass windows, traffic kept moving down the bright, cold Monday street. Part of me wanted to get angry, slam my hand down on the table, break open into tears like someone finally being given permission to hurt. But the other part of me only felt tired. A deep, quiet tiredness, the kind that comes when you realize you have not been standing in a damaged family all these years. You have been standing inside a system that grew so used to living off your silence and your money that it stopped seeing either one as anything unusual. I took out my phone. Daniel did not ask what I was doing. Maybe he already knew. I opened my banking app and went through every automatic payment I had once set up with the simple belief that it was the right thing to do. The monthly transfer into my parents' joint account. The extra insurance payment. The utility bills. The steady support money that kept flowing in to patch the places no one else was willing to look at directly. I canceled them one by one. The screen lit up and dimmed again with each short, cold confirmation. Daniel looked at me over the edge of the file. "You sure? I'm not cutting them off," I said. "I'm stepping away from something they had no right to do to me." He nodded and said nothing more. Somehow that silence made my own words ring louder in my head. Because for the first time in many years, I understood the difference between helping and being used. Between love and being treated like an endless resource. I had just reached for my coffee when my phone vibrated. An unknown number. I stared at it for a few seconds, then opened the text. It was only one line. She said, "Your mother knew. Your father signed without reading." "I'm sorry." "Caleb," I read it once, then again. There was no long explanation. No defense. Just one sentence, so short it left no room to twist into something else. My heart dropped hard inside me. Not because I was completely surprised, but because there are things you can already suspect and they still hurt like a fresh wound the moment they are confirmed. My mother knew. My father signed without reading. One of them knew. One of them did not care enough to know. And both were enough for my name to be erased from the house I had spent years keeping upright for them. I turned the phone face down on the table, but the words still seemed to glow on the black screen like a cut that would not close. That afternoon, Daniel filed the first set of formal challenges. He sent notice to the county office, the bank, and the attorney representing the lender. Everything moved quickly, precisely, coldly, with almost no space for emotion to get in the way. But I knew emotion would come eventually. This time, it just did not come for me first. It came for them. Sophie called me the next morning before I had even finished half my coffee. My phone kept vibrating on the kitchen counter so insistently I almost let it ring until it stopped. But in the end, I answered. Maybe because somewhere in me, I wanted to hear what would still be left of my sister's voice once the first layer of performance had been stripped away. "Lauren, you can't do this to me." Sophie was crying from her very first sentence. Not the kind of tears displayed in front of an audience. This was broken, breathless, panicked crying. "The bank just called. They froze the line of credit. You have to call your lawyer and make him pull it back." I said nothing. "I swear to you, this wasn't my idea at first. Mom said just do it first and explain later. Then Dad said if you knew, you'd agree anyway. I was just trying to keep everything from falling apart." I listened to her breathing hard on the other end. Only seconds earlier, it had been Mom's fault. Then Dad's. And by the last sentence, she had already swung back around to the oldest excuse in our family. Everything they ever did to me could be dressed up with the words, "for the family." "I was only borrowing it for a little while," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I was gonna pay it back." I cut her off for the first time in many years. "You didn't borrow from me." Silence. "You erased me first," I said slowly, clearly enough that I could hear every word myself. "You didn't borrow from me. You erased me first." I hung up before she could say anything else. My hand stayed perfectly steady as I set the phone back down on the table, but inside my chest there was a space that felt both painful and lighter at once. Like stitches that had been pulled too tight were finally beginning to come loose. I did not feel triumphant. I only felt the truth beginning to settle into its own weight. In the days that followed, everything collapsed the way temporary supports collapse once you pull out the last beam holding up the ceiling. Sophie's studio started failing almost immediately. Daniel told me the bank had temporarily blocked any additional draws from the credit line. No more money to patch over cash flow. No revolving cushion to cover rent, payroll, or inventory. Caleb sent me a few brief messages here and there, just enough for me to piece together the full picture without asking questions. 2 employees were let go. The landlord sent a late notice. A shipment of cosmetics was held because it had not been fully paid for. The growing business my mother had always spoken about so proudly in front of relatives turned out to be more fragile than anything they had ever piled onto my shoulders. Then the phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. I stared at her name on the screen for quite a while before I answered. Her voice held no tears, no regret, only the anger of someone finally being forced to face a real bill. "How could you do this to your own family?" she asked, without hello, without hesitation. I leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter and looked out the window at the bare branches trembling in the wind. "You're asking me that after the papers were filed," I said. "Not before everyone signed them." She went silent for a beat, as if she was not used to being answered that plainly. Then she exhaled sharply into the phone. "You're making everything worse." "No," I said. "I'm just no longer the only person keeping it from getting worse." She hung up. No apology, no explanation. Only the severed line between 2 women who had called each other mother and daughter for nearly 40 years and still had never truly understood the cost of those words. My father called the next night. His voice was softer than usual, as if the past few days had drained some part of his breath away. "Bertie," he said. He had not called me that in a very long time. "Sophie made a mistake." I closed my eyes, only for a second, just long enough to keep my voice from breaking. "No, Dad," I said. "A mistake is a typo. This was a plan." There was a long silence on the other end. I heard the television somewhere in the background of their house, the creak of a wooden chair, then my father's breathing, heavy and tired. He did not argue after that. Maybe because there was nothing left to argue. Some things, once they are finally called by the right name, can never be stuffed back into softer words. That weekend, Aunt Evelyn drove to my apartment. She brought an old paper box with worn corners and yellowing tape still stuck to the side. I made tea for her, and while I was setting the 2 cups down on the table, she opened the box slowly, as if she were opening something that held not only objects, but years nobody had ever wanted to name out loud. Inside were a few old photographs of Grandma Rose, a stack of handwritten recipes, a faded floral cloth, and a photocopy of a letter Grandma Rose had once written to Evelyn years earlier. Aunt Evelyn slid the paper toward me. "She wanted you to have this a long time ago," she said softly. "I think now is the time." I picked it up. Grandma Rose's handwriting showed through in uneven dark and light strokes on the copied page, and just seeing it made my throat tighten. In the letter she wrote that she worried I would let the whole family lean on me until I was worn through. She wrote that she was afraid I would grow up confusing love with duty, kindness with being taken from piece by piece, while still calling it the right thing. There was one line that made me stop for a long time. "Lauren's heart is strong, but strong hearts are the easiest to lean on until they crack." I set the letter down and held my teacup with both hands after it had already cooled a little. Suddenly, everything that had happened in the past few days stopped feeling like revenge. It was not delayed anger either. It was the moment I had finally done the one thing the person who understood me best in the world had always feared I would never be strong enough to do. Step back from the place where people only knew how to lean on me, before I broke any further. Spring came slowly that year. Cold days still clung to the windowsills of my apartment, even after the calendar had turned to April. During that time, everything gradually moved toward exactly where it was always going to land. The fraud was reversed. My name was restored to the paperwork, not as a victory, but as a necessary step in cleaning what had been dirtied. Sophie accepted a legal agreement that kept her out of prison, but in exchange came years of repayment, monitoring, and a record nobody in that town could honestly pretend to forget. Her studio closed before spring had fully warmed. Caleb moved out not long after that, and my parents had to sell the land behind the house to hold on to the home they had once assumed would always stand, no matter who had to keep propping it up underneath. My father did not call again. Maybe there are things men like him do not have the courage to say out loud, so they write them instead. Aunt Evelyn was the one who brought me his letter, folded carefully inside a cream-colored envelope, softened and wrinkled at the corners. I left it on the kitchen table for almost a full day before opening it. Inside was one sheet of handwritten paper in my father's familiar square handwriting, slow and careful, as if every sentence had to fight its way through a lifetime of silence before it could take shape. He wrote that he had always known I was the one keeping everything from collapsing. He wrote that he had seen it for longer than I probably realized. He had just chosen not to say it, because in his mind, I was the child who was strong enough to take it. He wrote that phrase and then crossed it out once, but I could still see the indentation of the ink under the kitchen light. Then he wrote it again, shorter and plainer. I thought strength meant you needed less. I was wrong. There was one other thing inside the envelope, wrapped in a piece of old soft paper. When I opened it, I found Grandma Rose's turquoise ring. I sat down very slowly, the ring resting in my palm, so light it almost felt weightless, and yet carrying an entire lifetime of memory inside it. My mother never called to offer a full apology. She had never been the kind of woman who knew how to walk all the way down the road of truth if it required looking directly at the weakest part of herself. But she also never again talked to me about duty, blood, or those invisible debts families like to place on the shoulders of whoever is easiest to love from a distance. When all the final paperwork was complete, I sold my ownership share in that house for a symbolic amount, not because it had no value. Quite the opposite. It was worth far more than they had ever admitted. But I did not want my name tied any longer to their version of survival. Not after they had tried so hard to erase it from the documents. I wanted it truly over, cleanly over, with no thread left behind, strong enough for someone to pull me back into my old role. One evening at the end of May, I sat alone in my small apartment with the window cracked open, the breeze carrying the smell of freshly cut grass from the courtyard below. I slipped Grandma Rose's ring onto my hand. The stone caught the soft yellow light from the kitchen, quiet and steady, the way she had been in life. I looked out at the street, and for the first time in many years I did not feel lonely. I did not feel bitter either. I only saw clearly that I was no longer a bridge for other people to walk across, wearing me down, cracking me, and still expecting me to stay standing, as if that were the only reason I existed. I used to think loving people meant staying, no matter how much it hurt. Now I understand that sometimes love does not look like staying. Sometimes it looks like walking away without begging to be let back in. And maybe that is what I have thought about most after everything that happened. Not who won, who lost, who gave something up, who managed to keep something. But that sometimes in life, the thing that saves us is not an apology that arrives at the right moment, and not even justice arriving as fully as we once hoped. Sometimes the thing that saves us is simply the moment we finally say to ourselves, enough. I am not telling this story because I want anyone to hate my family. I am telling it because I know there are so many people out there who have sat at a table just like that, in a house just like that, smiling through something that made their heart ache just to keep the peace for everyone else. There are people who spend years becoming the one everyone leans on, and then one day realize nobody ever really held them up in return. And if you are one of those people, I just want to say that I understand. I truly do. I have a question for you, and I hope you answer honestly. If your family called you tomorrow after years of silence, what do you think they would say? Help me. Or, I'm sorry. If you want to share, leave your answer in the comments. I do read them, and sometimes the stories people leave there help someone else feel a little less alone. And if you are still listening, if stories like this reach you in some way, you can subscribe and stay with me here. Not just to hear another sad story or another shocking twist, but to walk together through stories that feel real, about family, about hurt, about boundaries, and about the moment a person finally chooses themselves. In the description, I also left more stories for you. Other voices, other lives that might reach you in very different ways. Maybe somewhere in them, you will hear a piece of yourself. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. Truly, that means more than I can say. I'll see you in the next video.